Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Kamala Harris's speech at the DNC convention last Thursday was in many ways her introduction to the country she hopes to lead, a chance to make her case to a nation still getting to know her. Her campaign continues to feel a bit like a startup, finding its rhythm and momentum as they go. Yet, with the election looming in just 9 weeks, or even sooner for those voting by mail, the campaign is rapidly approaching its final sprint. Fresh off what was widely considered a triumphant convention, the Democratic ticket dove into its first week on the campaign trail, featuring an unscripted CNN interview in which Harris sought to position herself as both a steadfast ally of President Joe Biden's administration and a harbinger of a new political era, one that above all seeks to leave behind the toxic divisiveness of the Trump years. Trump, meanwhile, made headlines twice, neither flattering. His entourage flouted the rules, forbidding political use of Arlington Cemetery, and then roughed up a guard who tried to stop them. Later in the week, Trump attempted a clumsy pivot to position himself as a defender of reproductive rights, a move that not only highlighted his moral vacuity, but also underscored his campaign's clear anxiety over Kamala Harris's growing advantage on this issue in the polls. To take stock of an extraordinarily dynamic and consequential race in the pivot point between the DNC convention and the first presidential debate, we welcome 3 of the wisest and most experienced political commentators in the country. And they are Josh Marshall, a journalist, blogger, and the founder of Talking Points Memo, which in 2007, ancient history in blogland, became the first but still only blog to win the George Polk Award for legal reporting. Josh also hosts the Josh Marshall podcast. Josh, as always, thank you very much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Heather Cox Richardson, a historian and history professor at Boston College, where she teaches 19th century American history, among other topics. Her hugely popular, I want to say 1.6 million Substack newsletter, Letters from an American, chronicles current events in the larger context of American history. Her most recent book is Democracy Awakening: Notes on the State of America. Heather, very happy that you could come back to Talking Feds.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And Charlie Sykes, founder and former editor-at-large of The Bulwark, an MSNBC contributor, and the author of 9 books, most recently, How the Right Lost Its Mind. His Substack newsletter is called To the Contrary. Welcome, Charlie Sykes, as always.
Good to be back with you, Harry.
I'm going to try to assuage my inferiority complex and not having a Substack by noting that our Talking Feds YouTube channel, where I give my takes on the day's events, is out there. All right. The Democratic National Committee held its convention last week, and as anticipated, it was an excited, even riotous gathering. Began with relief and gratitude for Biden's decision to step aside, but quickly turned to a Harris-Walz love fest. Let's just start with a general question. Other than the overall vibe, which we'll get back to, what outstanding moments, if any, were there that give at least the potential of actually affecting the dynamic of the race as opposed to just making everybody in the United Center ecstatic?
The acceptance speech that she gave, I think, was clearly the most important event, because this was her chance to introduce her to tens of millions of Americans. And of course, she did extremely well. I mean, when we are immersed in politics, and what we have to constantly remind ourselves is that she is unknown or unfamiliar to a lot of Americans. And also, the fact is that up until now, I think that perhaps she's been underestimated. And so for her to give that speech and to hit those notes was extraordinary. Now,
what do you mean by that speech and those notes, Charlie?
That she delivered it so forcefully and was able to present her biography, but then also a very centrist, patriotic message. And that was the second point I was going to make. For me, as a center-right viewer, the imagery of that convention reclaiming patriotism, freedom, and opportunity was really quite extraordinary, and it was clearly well thought out. And I have to say, it was, as somebody who's in touch with a lot of swing voters, I think the imagery of that was quite effective. Now, again, these things will often fade, but I think as we are having this conversation today, it does seem as if she is experiencing a post-convention bump. Obviously, there's a lot of time to go, but this was a very successful convention. The other point I wanted to make, though, is that I was here in Milwaukee for the Republican convention, which I thought was well done up until Donald Trump's rambling acceptance speech. But Republicans left Milwaukee absolutely giddy. It's not enough to say that they were confident. They were absolutely assured they were going to win. There was, the wind was at their back. You'd had the assassination attempt the week before. And I think that for a lot of Democrats, that was almost like a near-death experience where, another Trump term seemed inevitable. The contrast in the moods between that moment a few weeks ago, this is a little bit more than a month ago, and what you saw in Chicago is genuinely stunning.
Were you there, Josh?
No, I was not there. I actually have not been to a convention since 2004. As soon as we had staff, for whatever reason, I started sending people, and I never wanted to go again, which is weird because I enjoyed them.
I was there. It was a pretty good one as they go. But I do want to say it was very noteworthy to me, her claiming of the sort of patriotic centrist ground, and not only introducing herself, but introducing herself against a backdrop of sort of vague negative impressions among the American people. So in that sense, kind of hitting it out of the park.
I think the way Charlie put it is really similar to how I would put it. I mean, it was a good, solid convention that hit the marks that you want to mark. I wouldn't look back on it and say, wow, when this one thing happened, that was a game changer. But I think it's important to understand it in the context of how this race has been constructed, which is to say that Kamala Harris is all but a new figure on the national scene going back about 6 weeks. Now, of course, she has been the incumbent vice president for 3.5 years, but she didn't have a strong public image kind of either way. I think the focus groups that your former publication or, Bulwark, I thought they were very informative in the sense that the people that Sarah Longwell, that she was interviewing in those focus groups had a kind of a vaguely negative impression of Harris, but mostly they just didn't know much about her at all. And I think it's fair to say that the elite press in the country had that kind of negative impression based on these early stories, the beginning of the administration and so forth. In any case, it is all but unprecedented in modern American history that you have a convention that is really introducing someone who people don't know. There's always that, you're introducing to the people who haven't been paying close attention, or you're reintroducing or something like this. So to have her give a forceful speech with a strong message, and also to have Walz do it in a way that sort of spoke for him but reinforced her, those were more important than usual because there's still a significant kind of blank slate factor, even though the Democrats went into the convention with solid momentum in the polls and so forth. I want to go back to this issue of the way they front and centered the word and concept of freedom. And as Charlie was saying, kind of reclaiming, I would say, not just a patriotism, but a number of words that are consistently powerful words in American political and civic culture. And I agree with you. I don't think this was not happenstance or something they just kind of riffed at the spur of the moment. It's been something that's been percolating in Democratic politics going back about a decade, specifically freedom. Because as we know, freedom is one of the most canonical words at the center of American civic culture. And you have a lot of things that Democrats believe in, which are about personal autonomy, freedom, your ability for you and your family to live a life that isn't excessively burdened by economic precarity and all these kind of things. I remember I actually interviewed Pete Buttigieg shortly after the 2016 election, and this was when he was still fairly little-known mayor in Indiana, and he was very big on this. Why aren't we talking about these things through the language of freedom? And so I do think that one of the things they were able to do, they weren't saying, and so we're going to like jack up defense spending more. They weren't shifting their politics. They were explaining what has been fairly basic and standard Democratic politics in a different language. And that is something that they should do more of and should have been doing for a while, right? Because again, you speak in the idiom that is latent in American political culture. So I think that was a great idea. I think it was successfully executed. And, you know, kind of, again, back to the point that Charlie made, I mean, they were making a move to claim, I think, in a non kind of fatuous or conventional wisdom, the American center, which is to say we are going to make a play for these kind of core concepts and words in American political culture. So I think it was really solid, and it was more important than it otherwise would be because, again, people hadn't seen her give a speech before, and that's an important first impression.
So I'm going to suggest that it was perhaps a bigger ideological move than you two are suggesting, and that is that a number of things jumped out to me. But in terms of what was happening with Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, it seemed to me that they were taking the center, but that they were doing so in part by putting together the more traditional Democratic emphasis on the economy that you got out of President Joe Biden, together with what has historically been a Republican move toward reform, largely from the middle of the country, that I think Tim Walz represents. And one of the things that I think has been a big problem for the Democrats since 1972 is, and when they had the McGovern Commission that looked at opening up the Democratic National Committee and the nominating process, that the Republicans have jumped all over the idea of inclusion as being a form of what we would now call DEI, right? That somehow there was a quota system, at least unspoken within the Democratic Party, that Democrats were answering to in some sort of corrupt way, as in, you know, we're giving this position to a woman because we want women's votes. And it really jumped out to me that the language primarily of the women, but also of Tim Walz, who spoke at the Democratic National Convention, did not talk about being the first woman to do this or the first person of color to do this. And it was also really noticeable, I thought, that the people on Vice President Harris's team were Black. They did not wear white, which was what Hillary Clinton had done and what everybody in the audience did on one of the nights, I don't remember which, to honor the suffragists in the United States, to emphasize the votes of women. And by reclaiming the idea of community, the idea that the government is supposed to protect community, which is the principle that Frances Perkins laid down in 1935 when she sponsored the Social Security Act, the Democrats, I think, were reaching back to that idea of community. But unlike Frances Perkins and unlike people who have come since her, they really emphasized the roles of people who performed generally unrecognized labor. And those are primarily women. And, you know, things like quite literally, at least one speaker talked about her mother happily doing work that was unrecognized. And that idea of including in the American polity people whose work has not been recognized generally, but is so important for us to move forward. And the recognition that everybody has a space in that view is, I actually think, quite wrenching. I mean, if you look at, for example, the way we think about the civil rights movement and the March on Washington, for example, which was in many ways largely organized by women who were then told they couldn't speak at the march itself. It's almost a reclaiming of our real history. And that suggests, I think, a new moment in American political ideology, both for the Democrats and for the Americans as a whole. And I think you saw that reflected last night when Vice President Harris said to CNN's Dana Bash that she would not respond to Trump's comments about her being a Black woman. She said, that's old, we're going beyond that, and I won't have anything to do with that. That's like the Democrats really grappling with the landscape of the United States since the 1965 Voting Rights Act.
That's a really lovely point. I just want to follow up brief. I mean, it's also of a point, I think, Heather, with your Substack comments during the convention about the way, and you detected more of a sort of substantive thrusts that both look back to the 30s but look forward. On this DEI point, it was very noticeable to me. I was actually there, and speaker after speaker, if you looked at them in broad, of course, represented different folks, but they were all identifying themselves with their personal stories as being of the middle class. So what they were really saying is not bean counting, but rather America and the middle class necessarily is diverse, but that's not the point exactly. I just want to follow up on Josh's point, and really Charlie's as well, that something we also have to remind ourselves of is we think about this in terms of the proposals, but it's also just the feel in the room that there's no substitute for. They were the cool kids again, and just that kind of upbeat feel, which was very self-conscious. I'm just saying it's not just the words, it's the music, and the music that they did was very, I think, thoughtful and carefully selected.
So I want to follow up on that because I think going back to points that Josh and Heather both just made extremely well, one of the extraordinary things about this convention is the fact that you have the incumbent vice president of the United States who is running now as very clearly the candidate of change. And that you take the words and the music together and it feels fresh, it feels new. And you could see that she is a challenge to the status quo. And again, part of it is just sort of symbolic. I mean, and what actually impressed me is that you could see it and you could feel it. They didn't have to hammer it home. They didn't have to nail it to your forehead that this is what where we're doing here. But again, it's very difficult for vice presidents, particularly if you're the vice president to an unpopular incumbent president, to be able to run with the kind of enthusiasm that she is, but also to be able to say that I represent a change from the status quo. And so, in terms of the vibe, and I'm trying to withhold the irrational exuberance and all the talk about joy, joy, and all of that. But you could just see that they're also tapping into the exhaustion in the American people about the kind of politics that we're having right now, the ugliness of it. And that sense that maybe we can turn the page. And I think that that's part of the enthusiasm and also part of the dynamic. And the moment that Heather just highlighted where Dana Bash asked her about, well, what about, Donald Trump's racist comments about you? And she just says, yeah, we're just going to move past that. That I thought was the most interesting part of that interview because,
Me too.
Because I do wonder, it's like, can we actually have a politics that is not down in the shit with Donald Trump? Now, it's going to be more of a challenge. I'm sorry to get ahead of ourselves when she debates Donald Trump, because, of course, how do you stand on stage and not be sullied by being next to this howler monkey who's, flinging feces at you all the time? How do you maintain some sort of distance and dignity? But it was interesting that she tried that. So I know there's a lot of sneering now about the whole vibe thing. But enthusiasm is real, engagement is real, and trying to take the longest term view, sometimes there are just moods in a certain year. In 1992, people wanted change. There was nothing that George H.W. Bush was going to do about it. 1980, I think, as well. 2016, the voters did not want same old, same old. They wanted change so desperately that they went with the howler monkey. I just sense that this is the theory of the case now, that the country is ready to move on. And she did two things. Number one, she made all the changes, the moves that we were talking about. But also, I think that she's understanding that what the Republicans are do is say, she's scary, she's too dangerous. And she's saying, I'm not that threatening. This is change, but it's not going to be radical change. But the fact that she's got the progressive wing, like they're giving her a lot of slack, they're cutting her a lot of slack, and she's able to do this is actually pretty impressive for somebody, and I will admit that I'm one of those who had a high degree of skepticism about her political abilities. I am a big fan of Veep, and I actually am one of those guys that would share the social media things back and forth with, Julia, Dreyfus and Kamala Harris and all of those things. So the Kamala Harris that we saw at this convention was a surprise to me.
I mean, her 2020 race was not great. It's not just that it didn't go well. I mean, the big thing, because I went into that cycle thinking maybe she's the one. Right? She's kind of the whole package and all this kind of stuff. What I saw, what really soured me on her political instincts, was I saw her a number of times jump onto policies that were currently hot on the progressive left, but without looking 4 or 5 steps ahead. Like, okay, I'm going to do Medicare for all, but you got to think a week later, you're going to start getting questions about, are people going to be able to hold on to their private insurance? And we can all say, oh, we all hate private insurance, but people kind of want these kind of things. Like, you need to be thinking 4 or 5 steps ahead. And my take from that race was like, I did not see the 4 or 5 steps ahead. And that worried me a lot. And I think, the irony is that when you see her now having to say why she's sort of on the Obamacare bandwagon as opposed to the Medicare for all bandwagon, I think she was off the Medicare for all bandwagon within a week of the announcement back in 2019. She wasn't on that bandwagon for more than a few days, but obviously you kind of have to talk about these things in a certain way. On Heather's point, I totally agree. I am not thinking of language in this way as a superficial packaging for policies. I mean, as we know, language and ideology you can never really disentangle them from each other. I'm more saying that she was doing this without making big moves on hard policy questions, that she was taking what is a fairly recognizable policy package that you can say the Democrats have had at least back through Biden's presidency, in a lot of ways back through the late Obama years. Final point, you've each mentioned this part in the interview where Dana Bash, what about Donald Trump's Black Indian thing? And I really think what the Trump campaign was trying to do there, they thought this was going to be a little like what happened with Barack Obama, that he was going to hit her with this. Everybody was going to say, oh, that was inappropriate, that was gross, that was racist. They were going to go back and forth. And a week or so later, they're going to put Harris forward and she's going to have like a teachable moment about race in America, about how there are biracial people and all these kind of things. I think that's what they wanted. They wanted to get race right back into the center of the entire thing, realizing that making that a fulcrum of the campaign, even if Trump took some hits in the short run, that was going to work for them. And she basically did the same thing she did with Dana Bash. They basically said like, oh, dude, like, well, what's your problem? I'm not sure they were on to weird yet, but just like, you're weird. Like, what is wrong with you? And I do think we're sort of past the weird era now, maybe, or unfortunately, but I do think some version of that is what you need to do with Trump, and some version of that in the debate, because the sweet spot for him, and it's why the weird thing that Tim Walz was doing connected so well, is that when they're talking about like getting really upset about trans people or this stuff about tampons and stuff, that if you kind of dig into that, trans visibility is at a different level than it was when most of us were growing up or in our 20s or 30s. It's new for people. But I think a lot of people, I think that the center of gravity in this country sees stuff like that and just like, dude, what? Like, it's weird. Why are you so obsessed with it? It's a bit much. And I think that also gets you to the turning the page thing. David Frum had this great tweet that I think cut to the heart of it, which was that in that period when a week or so, when everything was about weird, that the reason that Republicans were struggling with it is that they didn't actually realize what it meant, how people were receiving it. And that was an obsessive hostility to women, something like that. And that's why when they came back, like, oh, I'm weird. Here's a picture of you with this freakish trans person. You're weird. That wasn't a good response. That just drove the point home. Like, what's your problem? So I hope that she does that jujitsu with him in the debate, because again, I think that's the turning the page. Like, not even getting into all these like high octane screaming matches. Just like, what's wrong with you? Like, why do you talk that way? We're done.
Yeah, it's the rhetorical equivalent of Obama's, doing this. I think it's very effective and probably infuriating to him. I'll just say that much of what everyone's saying here to me highlights that she's proven herself to have surprisingly strong political skills, and we really just don't know about governing skills. We really just don't know about policy, but it's enough now for most Democrats. But she needed perhaps to answer these implicit accusations that she hasn't been forthright about her positions, and here was her unscripted talk with Dana Bash. Basically, did she, do no harm and adequately answer the Republican criticisms?
I think so. I think it was fine. I think it was good. She moved past that when are you going to do an interview thing. I don't think it was a big step forward in the sense that kind of inevitably, and this is why I think they were resisting doing it, most of Bash's stuff was just, I'm going to read you the list of Republican attacks and you're going to respond to them. So to the extent that it was like responding to attacks, I don't think it's like we're going to see like a bump in the polls from it or something like that. But I think she did perfectly fine and checked that box. And I hope they do more kind of alternative media, just because I think that's more effective. And honestly, to the extent that the elite press has this idea, well, we are the ones who dig deep. We're not some local TV reporter who doesn't know policy details. Kind of like when the Times was pushing for that interview with Biden. Like, you need to do an interview with the Times for America. This isn't about us, Joe. You need to do this. I mean, I'm not being critical of Bash, but I think that showed pretty quickly. You don't need to be a rock star to just ask about all the Republican attacks. I think that's more than enough of those kind of interviews.
It wasn't great, but it was okay. I mean, it was enough. She did enough.
But let's come back to that, because I've actually been watching her very closely and writing about her for 4 years. And you cannot dismiss that Joe Biden has gone out of his way to tutor her, especially in foreign affairs. And she has had a really successful, I know under the radar screen in America, but a very successful career in foreign affairs. And she's matured dramatically, I think, in that period of time. I would also suggest that when people are like, how is she going to be different than Biden? Certainly on the economy, why should she want to be different than Biden, right? So that's a little hard to stake out new turf. So again, if I got the opportunity to interview her, I would be asking about what seems to be this really big cultural shift in the Democratic Party and therefore in the United States, where they're making a play to pick up Republicans quite deliberately with talking, for example, about having a Republican in the cabinet. I know that's absolutely not unprecedented, but it seemed coming when it did and reaching out the way they have to Republicans to join Harris, that they really are trying to define a new moment in American political history, which I mean, I just find fascinating because this has been a long time coming, more than a generation in coming. But one of the things that I would love to run by you three, all people in the media whom I respect deeply, the fact we're sitting here talking about whether or not Vice President Kamala Harris, who gave perfectly coherent answers to real questions in a very normal political way, and sort of saying, she checked the boxes, when we have Donald Trump, who certainly seems to me, at least since the superseding indictment that came down, which I know we're not aiming to talk about, but the next morning in 4 hours, he tweeted 50 times with violence, calling for executions, QAnon. He doesn't seem to have been able to put a sentence together since then, and certainly not to answer a question. He's been all over the map with this abortion amendment in Florida, which he made a really damaging statement about. I think it was yesterday. I've lost track of the days. It seems to me either that we must grapple with what on earth is going on with him, or grapple with the fact the media is treating this as, Harris needs to check these boxes, and we're a little bit concerned about the way she approached the conditions in, wherever. And then he's over there going, let's kill my enemies. And I'm having trouble writing about it myself, but I'm also really beside myself at the fact that we are not recognizing that this man is, even 10 years ago, if he had behaved the way he is now, he would have been the crank screaming in the corner of a parking lot. And now people are like, he was making a joke. I just don't even know what to do with that. What do you guys think about it?
No, I agree. This is actually where I'm coming from on all of this, that we're talking about, has Harris explained her flip-flop on fracking? Well,
Exactly.
Excuse me, during this particular news cycle, Donald Trump was setting himself on fire. I mean, one of the most dramatic flip-flops I've ever seen on the issue of abortion, now saying that he wants to have a socialized medicine for in vitro fertilization. I mean, this was pretty extraordinary. And then the incredible QAnon meltdown that occurred that Heather was just mentioning. And I've actually been spending most of my time kind of doing what you're talking about. There has been this tendency on the part of the media, and this is Aaron Rupar's phrase, which I'm borrowing from him, to sane wash Donald Trump, to find some nugget of coherence amid all of this gibberish cataracts of nonsense. And this is a real problem. I was thinking about this before we started today, that after 9 years of dealing with this, the media still has not figured out how to deal with Donald Trump because the man is so far outside the norm of not just political behavior, but of just what we think of as normal, rational human behavior. And it's hard to cope with that. So, yeah, there is this bizarre asymmetry between trying to ask, is Kamala Harris being a traditional normal candidate, while meanwhile, you have Donald Trump sitting there in Mar-a-Lago with one insane tweet after another, QAnon. I mean, and again, not subtle tweets, not hinting at it, but pure QAnon with pictures of his political opponents in orange jumpsuits and talking about military tribunals for Barack Obama. So this is part of the challenge, is how do you deal with this massive crazy? And I hope we do talk a little bit about what he's doing on abortion, because I sort of a grudging respect for Trump's reptilian instinct sometimes. But right now, I'm seeing a guy who is just basically throwing stuff up against the wall and giving out free shit, that he's trying to do anything he can to turn this around. So while she's moving to the center, he is kind of floundering here. And I have to say, I spent a lot of time over the last 24 hours looking to see, like, what are pro-life conservatives saying about his waffling on the Florida amendment. And now I am cynical enough to think that they're going to, come back at some point. But there's some real sort of like come to Jesus moment, like, holy crap, who knew that Donald Trump was a man without any principles whatsoever, that he would throw the entire evangelical movement under the bus because he's seeing some poll numbers here. And it is kind of interesting because this is one of those moments where, when you make the Faustian bargain, it often doesn't work out the way you wanted. And suddenly the entire pro-life movement is going, what's happening here? And here's a challenge for the media. The problem for Donald Trump is that vote in Florida is yes or no. It's up or down. It is a binary choice. You either vote to basically incorporate Roe, or you vote for the 6-week ban. His comments to NBC would suggest that he, after all these years, has no fixed position on it, does not even understand what the amendment says.
It sounds like he thought he could vote for 8 weeks, maybe.
Right.
Like
exactly.
You're going to get a spectrum.
A few more weeks,
I'm
right?
going to go for 8. Yeah.
If he votes in favor of the amendment, then he has clearly thrown the pro-life movement completely under the bus. If he votes against the amendment, then he is basically endorsing a 6-week ban, and that's a hell of an issue. Now, I just saw this right before we came on, that Harris is planning a 50-stop bus tour of Florida focusing on reproductive rights. So they have the sense that he's in a vice on this one. And I don't know how he gets out of it because it is, again, you either vote yes or you vote no.
Well, what was striking to me about that, and this goes to the sort of sane washing you discussed, is that the write-up that I saw about his comments is that he said X, and then the campaign clarified his position.
Which it didn't.
Yeah, but really, he came out and said, yeah, I'm going to vote for it. And then his campaign said, no, he's not voting for it. That's not clarifying a position. That's like taking back what you said. No one else gets treated like that. That's not a clarifying a position. And as Charlie says, he's so overdetermined because he's not saying what he's going to do, which is another weird non-position, that he clearly doesn't even know what it even is. That it's not, you can just pile on a couple weeks. I mean, look, he's clearly held to no standard whatsoever. In my point of view, there's a structural imbalance that has existed between how Republicans and Democrats are treated going back a long way. It's at a totally different level with him. And I think some of that is that it's hard. What do you do with a guy who is going on Twitter, making comments about 2 people he's run against and blowjobs and murdering people? I mean, it is genuinely hard to, like, where do you put that on the matrix of activity?
It's almost every day you have an Access Hollywood video comes out, and it's like, okay, we've done that, and we can't deal with it anymore, right, every day.
I think a key issue is, and this is something that I think is really structural with how the press thinks about Donald Trump, I think if you were actually to give reporters a truth serum and ask, why did you do this and do that? I think the answer is something like, his supporters don't care. So if we talk about it a lot, Democrats will agree with us. His supporters don't care. So it's like screaming into the wind. And to a certain extent, that's true. They don't care. But what is implicit in that is a deeply political idea of what journalism is, that your editorial decisions are based on electoral impacts, which is night and day. You should never think that. So the fact that his supporters don't care is irrelevant. You need to make an independent editorial decision about what matters.
It's time now to take a moment to explain some of the terms and relationships that you've heard so much about in this podcast and on cable TV over the last couple years in a segment that we call Sidebar. Today, Grammy-nominated soul and blues singer Betty LaVette will tell us the definition of conspiracy under federal law. Betty LaVette's career began at age 16 in Detroit, Michigan, the Motor City, and her first single, My Man, He's a Loving Man, was released by Atlantic Records, but did not achieve lasting recognition for her incredible voice until she released her 2005 album, I've Got My Own Hell to Raise. Betty received a Pioneer Award from the Rhythm and Blues Foundation in 2006 and sang, as many of you saw, at President Obama's inaugural celebration. Her latest album, Things Have Changed, is available now.
What is conspiracy under federal law? Federal law and the law of many states treat conspiracy to commit a crime as a separate offense from the crime itself. Under federal law, there are dozens of statutes criminalizing conspiracy. 18 U.S.C. Section 371, called the General Conspiracy Statute, forbids a conspiracy to commit any other federal crime. Other laws criminalize conspiracy to commit specific offenses such as murder, drug trafficking, or civil rights violations. A conspiracy is an agreement between two or more people to commit a crime or achieve a legal end through improper means. The agreement can be established with evidence of express or implicit agreement. Some conspiracy laws also require proof of an overt act or a concrete step to achieve the goals of the conspiracy. This can include simple things like buying supplies, but the conspiracy is a crime even if its goals are not achieved. Conspiracy laws rest on the belief that criminal partnerships represent a different and greater threat than the underlying offenses. The Supreme Court has explained that groups of criminals are more likely to be successful and commit additional crimes and less likely to abandon plans than are lone criminals. Conspiracy law provides prosecutors with a powerful set of tools against a defendant. Section 371, conspiracies are punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Other conspiracy statutes carry the same penalties as the substantive offenses. A conspirator is also responsible for the foreseeable actions and consequences of the conspiracy, even if he or she did not specifically agree or know about them. At trial, the government may introduce the statements of co-conspirators, even if those statements would otherwise violate the rule against hearsay. A conspiracy continues until its objective is achieved or the co-conspirators stop committing overt acts to further it. An individual who has joined the conspiracy is responsible for its actions until he or she clearly withdraws from the conspiracy by telling the co-conspirators or going to the police. For Talking Feds, my name is Betty LaVette.
Thanks very much to Betty LaVette. If you have the chance to see Betty in concert, it is beyond worth it. You can see where her upcoming performances will be at bettylavette.com. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine & More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thanks, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we break out the 3 types of vodka to see if there's a clear difference. Vodka is typically a colorless, flavorless spirit, served neat and freezer chilled. Simple, right? But long before the shot glasses are topped off and toasts are shouted, there's a fermenting process. For vodka, that process involves distilling an organic base like barley, rye, wheat, even potatoes or corn to make one of 3 types of vodka: plain, flavored, and infused. Rye can add a heavier texture and spice. Barley may be a little lighter and mild, while potatoes can add a creamy mouthfeel. Unflavored is the simplest and most traditional form of vodka, with a mixture of 40% ethanol and 60% water. Flavored vodka has recently become extremely popular, adding flavors that range from fruit to dessert-inspired options like chocolate. A charcoal-filtered vodka provides a smoother taste, perfect for creating a chocolate martini that tastes as great as it sounds. Lastly, there's infused vodka, also known as botanical vodka, where the distillers infuse the vodka by adding ingredients like herbs, flowers, spices, and fruit, which are steamed into the spirit during the distillation process. It's an excellent choice to dial your drink in any flavor direction you want. The best part of them all is that you don't have to travel the world to find the greatest vodkas. Your local Total Wine & More has a large selection of every type and flavor, so all you have to do is clear out a little extra room in your freezer. So find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. First, I want to move on to Trump, but just bring it back a little to the campaign. I totally agree with everything Heather and others have said, and I've been, exasperated like everyone else and pulling my hair out, and why does the media do this? But we are making a meta critique of the media, and I think the short answer, historians will put it into perspective, but it's not going to change. But it is one of the reasons why this sort of dismissive, almost making fun of his outrage. And I'll just add, when we're piling on the lunacy, Josh referred to it, but this week he made a comment about blowjobs and suggesting that basically trying to align Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton and, Willie Brown, stuff that if a Democrat said, I think it would be, the end of a political career. But for all that reason, I feel like they've hit on something that I think is effective and is the antidote for the pulling of my hair out that I've done for years and years. That at least for the next couple months, this kind of, this stupid, weird, old, sick fuck is, I think, the political riposte that cuts through some of the media stuff. But let's leave it aside and go to Trump now. His biggest event of the week was this visit to Arlington National Cemetery. Another bad week that turned into a full-fledged debacle with Trump staffers ignoring rules and being disrespectful, as boorish and as arrogant as they get, which is saying a lot. So, Charlie, let me start with you. You wrote in The Atlantic that, in the end, it merely served to remind Americans how little he understands about service, sacrifice, and heroism. I guess my point kind of goes back to what we were just saying. Is this enough of a gaffe of stepping in it that it sticks a little bit to him? Or is this just, forgotten in 2 days?
Look, I don't know. But going back to Josh's point, at some point we just need to say what we think about all of this, that this is just a reminder who Donald Trump is. This is a deeply broken man. The incredible, hypocrisy of him claiming to be a champion of men and women in arms when he has such a long track record of denigrating their service, whether you're talking about disabled veterans in parades, he doesn't want to see them because they make him look bad, John McCain's POW status, the suckers and losers. This is who Donald Trump is. And I think that it's important to constantly be looking at him and remembering, how outrageous his conduct is and his willingness to violate norms, to violate the law, and then to smear people who call him out on it is really extraordinary. So again, I don't know. I remember talking with a prominent Republican back in 2016 after the Democratic convention when Trump was attacking the Gold Star family. And at that point, he was hurt in the polls and it went away. I don't know, but we'll just have to see. I think it just sort of adds again to the sense of exhaustion that his act feels so old and stale to me now.
I think the thing about Donald Trump and the military is Donald Trump is a fan of violence on his behalf. So there is an aspect of the U.S. military he really likes. It's institutionalized violence. That's what an army is. Tough guys, killing, weapons. And that's what an army is. Most of us accept that. That is how states sometimes interact with each other. But the things about sacrifice, about the solemnity of being the person who gives up their life and doesn't get to participate anymore in the American experience so other people can, is a joke to him. And you even see that in these pictures with the thumbs up at the grave. Like, it's been a while since Donald Trump, even when he does this stuff about sex acts and QAnon, I've seen that a million times. Seeing someone with a sort of a shit-eating grin and a thumbs up at someone's grave is just, again, a person who is, it's like, we used to hear those kind of urban legends about a person raised by wolves or snakes or something who hasn't been like acculturated to what it means to be like human or something. That's bizarre. That's just bizarre. And that one thing that he said to John Kelly about they're losers.
John Kelly having lost a child in the service.
Yeah, but you see that as pure Trump. They're suckers. Why wouldn't you get your own action? Why would you give up your stuff for someone else? That's loser behavior. And he really thinks that. So again, the military thing isn't why it works for some people, but why it is so inconsistent. Again, he likes violence. He likes violence on his behalf. And that's a big part of what military life is. It is a violent enterprise. But the whole, again, the sacrifice part of his brain is missing. He doesn't even understand it, let alone is incapable of it.
One of you said the word performance, and I think that really matters. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Charlie, about the Republican National Convention. And that's that for Trump, much of his interaction with the cameras, if you will, is a performance. I mean, it is deliberately patterned on professional wrestling. The idea of always moving forward, always slamming somebody, always putting somebody down, always dominating. And I can see, Josh, how his impression of the military would be like that. But I think this actually speaks back to this change that we're seeing, at least that I'm seeing among the Democrats, this emphasis not on the performance of dominance, which is a performance that many of us in the United States have been on the losing end of, but rather what we're seeing from the Harris Democrats, the performance of community and support. And that, in this moment, I think Trump doesn't know how to grapple with. And I do think this one will stick. I don't know anybody who doesn't have people in the military or have had people in the military or have decorated a grave or have, complained about gravestones being pushed over. I mean, they are called sacred ground for a reason. And I think it's going to hit a lot of people that he really just is in the past.
That's a really great point. God, I wish we could go for another hour, but we're almost out of time. I just want to end with a quick poll taking to the three of you. The latest polls show Harris up 5 points, an 8-point shift. But of course, we're on this post-convention maybe bump. I just want to say, at this point, do you see this as a total toss-up, or has she nosed ahead as we currently are in Labor Day?
I think it's still a toss-up. I hate to be the buzzkill, but I think it's still a toss-up because of the Electoral College.
I think it's a toss-up with a general advantage to her, but it's certainly a toss-up in the sense, like right now, she is nominally ahead, I think, in all but one swing state. But most of those leads are 1 or 2 points. So you don't even need a polling error for her to lose all of them, right? They're all very close. Certainly, I would be totally shocked if she doesn't win the popular vote. But as we've learned going back 25 years, that's not what the game's about, right? So I toss up with a bit of general advantage towards her. I mean, the other way to look at it is that he is at least a touch behind in 4 or 5 states that are absolute must-wins for him. That's being back on your heels. But I agree, generally toss-up.
I'm going to go with toss-up and add to what Charlie said about the Electoral College, the attempts of the Republicans to suppress the vote and to put their own people into critical spaces when it comes to certifying the electoral results. So, again, I'm fascinated by the larger picture. It looks like we're looking at something new in the Democratic Party and therefore in the United States, I think. But that does not translate into an automatic win.
So 3 votes for toss-up. We only have 1 minute left for our Talking 5 feature where we take a question from a listener. Each of us has to answer in 5 words or fewer. Today, J.D. Vance has been ridiculed online for his awkward interactions with everyday folks on the campaign trail. How should he prove he's a regular guy?
Don't be weird. That's my 3 words.
There you go.
My 3 words would be get a life.
Another version of don't be weird.
Yeah. And my 2 would be he can't.
I'll give it a shot. Mountain Dew, America's official beverage. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Josh, Heather, and Charlie. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest exclusive offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mahendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu. Thanks very much to Betty Levette for explaining federal conspiracy law. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.